Okay, so we are talking about identity, going through Miss Carrie's book, and the chapter I get is God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And what does that even mean? Kind of like my koala bear friend here. Is it up there? What do you mean I'm not a bear? I have the qualifications. All right. That's the last one of those. So, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the call. Kind of a topic that's kind of like been a theme in my entire life. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 through 31, it says, "Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord." So, I mentioned that the idea of God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called, is really kind of near and dear to me because I grew up just kind of like this lame, boring kid from South Texas, not really exceptional or talented in any way. There's things that I'm really good at. I'm good at barbecuing. I'll take that one. I'm good at barbecuing. But, for the most part, I'm just kind of your average lame dude that grew up in a small town. But I did feel the call to ministry at a very young age. And so, going through high school, and then I decided, this call to ministry is real in my life. And so I went off to a small Bible college at a little town called Waxahachie, Texas. And Waxahachie is Indian for everything closes at dark. Like the only place to go after 8 p.m. was Walmart, which we played laser tag and hide and seek in and stuff as college students. So, and it consequently got kicked out. So, but yeah, so, when you're in a Bible college setting, you're living on campus, the year I went there, I think there was 2,000 kids on campus. And so there was, I say kids, I guess we're grown-ups. When you're college age, you're technically a grown-up, but we were kids. There's 2,000 of us, and it's kind of, you see the best of the best in some of these areas. We had chapel every day, so other guys and gals are getting to preach. There's people leading worship and sharing testimonies and all kinds of stuff like that. And I'm like, wow, I'm outclassed here. I'm not really a good preacher. I can't sing. I don't play an instrument. I'm not good in front of people. I just you really you get in that environment, you start playing that compare game in an unhealthy way. I'm like, God, why am I even here? And I legit struggled with, why am I here, God? There are so many more people here that are so much more qualified than I am to be in the ministry. Why did you even call me? Who remembers the song Scrubs by, was it TLC in the 90s? No, I don't want no scrubs. Well, that was me. I was the scrub. And thank you. And so even to the point, I'm called to the ministry, I'm going to be a youth pastor. I'm hoping to be a full-time youth pastor at a church. And so, which means I'm going to be preaching on a regular basis. And so one of my courses I had to take was Intro to Preaching and then Preaching Lab. And so they teach you their method of crafting a sermon. Back in those days, it was tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, make sure you have 3 points and blah, blah, blah. It's just real organized. And so you go through that. Then the Preaching Lab is basically debate class. And you actually, you create sermons and you share them in front of the class. Y'all, I almost failed that class. The class where I'm preaching before other Bible college students, I'm like the worst one. It's kind of like softball team. I'm the worst one. And so, in fact, the professor there, I guess in fairness, like he and I didn't really get along very well. The first week of class, he was a part-time professor and he was a pastor of a church, and he was sharing with us about this book that he recommends people. The book I think was called The Richest Man in Babylon. It was kind of an allegory on like how to let your money work for you and be smart about saving and blah, blah, just kind of that type of thing. And, I want to say this was the second or third day of class, and he's talking about it. And he said, so many people today are broke because they spend every single penny they make. And he paused, and before I could stop myself, I said, on books like that? And from then on, our relationship was very strained. And so and so that may have been part of the reason I almost failed preaching lab. Also, that I wasn't very good at preaching in those days. And, and as you can see, I really haven't improved much since then. But, I kind of struggled all through my early ministry. I'm like, God, I am not good enough to be here. And when I graduated Bible college, I thought I would just naturally the red carpets would be there waiting for me. Oh, Jason, you have a degree. Please come work for us and let us pay you lots of money. And that didn't happen. And I'm like, God, what's going on? And so, I just struggling and why am I here, God? Why am I called into ministry? And, the long version of my story is I ended up at a church as a volunteer junior high youth pastor. And, I was able to, later some things happened. I was able to walk that church help that church walk through a very difficult time. And then later I end up getting my dream job as being a full-time youth pastor at a church in the Houston area. And that was my identity. I was Jason. I was a youth pastor. Like when people would, hey, what's your name? Oh, I'm Jason. Yeah, what do you do? I'm a youth pastor. That's what I did. What my kids were into, I was into. Whatever video games they played, I played. Y'all, I was a grown-up, and I wore a belt with metal spikes on it and skater shoes. Listen, it's not pretty. Grown-ups shouldn't wear spike belts. I'm just going to say it. But my whole identity and self-worth was tied up in being a youth pastor and relating to these teenagers and being the cool youth pastor, wearing clothes that don't match and that type of thing. And and honestly, one day that went away. The really, really short version of that story is, the pastor of the church wanted to move in a different direction, and that move meant me. And all of a sudden, I find myself without an identity. I'm a youth pastor. Wait a minute. A youth pastor is a youth pastor of a youth group. What's a youth pastor without a youth group? Oh, he's a bum, So all of a sudden, I just find myself without an identity. And I kind of had an identity crisis, and I went through a couple years of just kind of wondering, okay, well, who am I? If I'm not a youth pastor, what am I? And it took me a while. I would jump from hobbies to hobby. I'm kind of ADD anyway, and so I kind of moved from hobbies to hobbies anyway. But I threw myself into a whole bunch of different hobbies. What do I like? What do I like doing? What's fun that won't kill me, but almost kill me? Almost kill me is okay, but killing me is not okay. So So I kind of just went through this, who am I? And, just continually struggling. I'm going to be honest with y'all. I've been here at the sanctuary. My wife and I have been attending here since 2017. I've been on staff here since late November 2018. And sometimes I struggle with, I don't really belong here either. I don't have a cool story. I'm just some boring kid who grew up in a small town, and I'm here all of a sudden and doing things and helping the sanctuary, run a food pantry, but nothing really special about me qualifies me to do that. I don't have, a doctorate in counseling or whatever. I don't have, a background in recovery. I've been in jail one night in my life for stealing street signs. I don't have this cool story. And so like even as an adult, I struggle with this idea of fitting in. So, and looking at this passage, Paul is talking to a group of people who have kind of let their calling go to their heads, who've kind of let the ministry that they're doing define them in almost an unhealthy way, right? And so Paul he's not trying to like beat them down, like you guys were bums and you're nothing but bums and you're always going to be a bum, like Rocky. It was like, he's like, hey, remember where you started, remember where you came from, because that's going to help you relate to the people you're ministering to. And so in this passage, Paul is really trying to draw attention away from their gifting and their calling, and he's trying to remind them, like, look, let's get centered here. Let's remember who we are and whose we are. Not to discourage them, but to draw their focus back to God, who was the source of their gifting and the source of their calling. We have a saying around here that character is greater than gifting. And what that means is like the core of the heart, your motivation, your heart, who you are, whose you are, being a child of God is more important than being able to like be up here and speak or being able to sing beautifully, right? And it's easy to get caught up in having the right credentials. It's easy to get caught up in what disqualifies you as well. Like culturally, looking at, back when Paul is teaching, culturally, things like birthright and social status or, wealth, political or religious affiliation, those things kind of like stacked people. There's like a hierarchy of things. The more influential people got to do more things and had more influence. And then the opposite was true. Like if you came from really humble beginnings, if you were just like, a carpenter or a fisherman or something, you weren't really worth listening to. And the gospel kind of turns that on its head, and it really evens the playing field. Those who are born into wealth and power and those who are born into poverty in the gospel of the kingdom are put on the same level playing field as children of God in their identity, as having value, as having worth. Everybody gets to play in the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is what determines your value. And so, Paul is trying to remind them that maybe they didn't have it all together at one point, but they are now children of God. And really okay, yeah, you're doing a great job, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Let's, remember your past and your beginnings, but don't be consumed by them, right? You may have failed, but you're not a failure. You may have been an addict, but you are recovered. You may have sinned, but you're forgiven, right? And so God, Paul is really trying to push them into recognizing the source of their gifting, the source of their calling, and who they're serving. Moving on to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. And so it was with me, brothers and sisters, when I came to you. I did not come with eloquence. See, I can't even say that word. Eloquence or human wisdom, as I proclaimed to you with the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness, with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. Paul here is even highlighting his own disqualifications. We all know Paul's story. He was, back when he was called Saul, which really, when he was Saul, I'm a little jealous because he was on the road to Damascus, so that he didn't have to wear a mask. Damascus. Your groans only make me stronger, just so you know. So Paul here he's highlighting his own deficiencies. And again, so it says, not so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. See, God has the habit of using the least likely of candidates to carry out his mission. Moses had a speech impediment, had low self-esteem, but yet he led an entire nation of people to freedom. David was a young shepherd boy and was able to defeat Goliath. Joseph, the youngest of his brothers, sold into slavery, ended up saving an entire nation of people from a great famine. The disciples were ordinary men who at one point in their lives were told that they weren't good enough to be the disciple of a rabbi. They were stubborn, they were prideful, some of them had bad tempers, and yet here they are traveling and living life with Jesus. Jesus himself, born in humble beginnings, in a manger, the son of a carpenter, becoming the Savior of the world, dying on a cross that was considered a criminal's death, an unhonorable or a dishonorable ending. God uses that now to redeem all of mankind. God has used the most unlikely heroes of faith, men and women who are underdogs, nobodies, misfits, ragamuffins, and rejects, all used to spread the gospel, share God's love, and grow the church. And the reason, back to verse 5, so that your faith may not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. When God uses the humble, the outcasts, and the misfits, he gets the glory. Not us, him. And that's what it's for. It's all for his glory. So our identity, our calling, our gifting, all of that should be pointing people to Jesus, not pointing people to ourselves. You know, my prayer every week when I get up here is, God, help me just be a vessel of you. Help me direct people to you and not to me. You know, like I mentioned before, I had a bit of an identity crisis of who I thought I was and what I thought I should be defined by. And it's easy to get caught up in especially like men, men are kind of doers, hunters, gatherers, providers, we build things. We can get caught up in like our identity being, the things we do. But our identity really comes through Christ. Our identity is in God. And so, it's easy to get caught up in your calling and forget who you're called by. In my ministry journey, I've struggled with burnout. And one of those things happens when like, oh man, I got this. Man, I can do this. Yeah, God, I don't need you right now, God. I've got this covered. And then all of a sudden, ministry and gifting just kind of becomes another job. It just kind of becomes another thing you do. You're punching a time clock, and you forget the reasons, you forget the whys, you forget the who, and you're just kind of going through the motions. It's easy to get busy working for the church and not being part of the church and not being part of the kingdom and not serving God. You're just kind of going through the motions. And like I said before, one of the things that I worry about, like, man, God, why aren't I as talented as Seth of a singer and musician? Or God, why don't I make as much money as someone else? Or why don't I have as much influence as this other person? Or why this, God, why that, why not me? And then you start all of a sudden your conversations start focusing inward, right? Instead of focusing outward. And the enemy will do that. The enemy will creep into us, and the enemy will be like, oh man, you are so much better at that than this other person. Why aren't you asked to do this more often? You're being wrong. It's like the enemy will kind of use your gifting and your calling against you. He'll try to use anything he can against you. And then that seed gets in there and kind of bitterness kind of rolls in. And so we have to, like Paul is saying to these people, remember who you were and know who you are now so that you can keep your focus on God. I'm going to wind down. I'm going to ask the worship team to come on back up. So as you're leaning into this, as you're learning to refocus on God, you're going to get a couple different voices coming at you. Some of those voices are going to be the doubters and the haters, the people who think, oh, you've messed up too much in your life. You can't share the gospel. You're a bad example. You're a hypocrite. Why are you up here? Who do you think you are? They're going to be the people who are going to hold your past against you instead of celebrating your future. Other people are going to be resenters. They're going to resent the fact that God has placed you in a place of influence, or God has placed a calling in your life, or placed a gifting in your life. Kind of like Joseph, the story of Joseph, his brothers were jealous of him. They resented him because he had these prophetic dreams of him one day helping the nation of Israel and his family. There's going to be people who resent you for your calling. But the good news is there's also going to be encouragers. There's going to be people like Carrie and Damon and Seth and Bob who are going to be like, you got this, man. There's a calling on your life. Let me tell you, folks, like, I still struggle with this whole preaching thing. Every time I preach, Carrie and Nathan are coming up, dude, I'm so excited you're here. Damon prays for me every time. Bob will pray. Like, these people around us here, like, they're lifting me up, and we're lifting each other up, and those are the voices you need to listen to. And I'm going to finish with this. You are not your past. The choices that you made in life, the decisions, the struggles, the addiction, the pride, the lust, whatever, you are not your past. But on the other side of it is, you are also not just your calling. You are not just your gifting. You're not just an awesome drummer. You're not just a great artist. You are a child of God, redeemed for his purpose and called, redeemed from your past and into his purpose. Sorry, I was trying to read what I wrote there. So you are not your past, and you are not simply just your calling. You're not just what you do for God. You are a child of God. You are redeemed for his purpose. You are called for his kingdom. So the worship team's going to play, and I just want to encourage you guys, just, worship God, lean into your identity. And it's not about, like, one of my hobbies is hiking the big peak, the 14ers of Colorado, these long peaks. And one of the cool things to do when you get up there around 13,000 feet, you're above tree line, you've been hiking since dark, the sun's finally coming up, you can turn and you can look back. And when you're above tree line, like, you can see a long ways, right? You can see that trail wind down and it hit the trees, and every now and then you can see clearings of the trail, and you can think, dude, I have come a long ways. Like, I've been hiking all morning. I've been hiking since 4 a.m., which I've done. And the sun's coming up, and you're like, I've come a long ways. But then you look at the peak, and you're like, oh, well, I'm not there yet. So it's okay to look back and remember where you're from. Remember the struggles, the hardships, the trials that have gotten you to where you are. But don't dwell in them, because that's not your identity anymore, right? Your identity is Christ. Your identity is God. So as you guys worship, just lean into your calling. Lean into your identity as children of God.
Thanks for tuning in to a message from the Sanctuary Church. For more information and media, go to our website at thesanctuarywestside.org or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube.